Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Ellen McGrattan, Director of the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute. I'm pleased that you could join us today for the economics of COVID-19. We have quite a few friends, former alum and faculty who are going to be talking on this very urgent topic, and I welcome them all here with us. Today we're going to have Professor Chari taking over as moderator, and we'll have 3 talks, and we've invited all of the co-authors of the papers to join us for a Q&A afterward. I hope this turns out to be a very informative talk or webinar, and I turn it now over to Chari.
Thank you, Ellen. Am I on? I don't know if I'm on. Hello. Can you hear me? Am I on? Not sure if I'm on.
Yeah, you are.
You're on, Chari.
Ah, okay, wonderful. I couldn't hear myself, and I wasn't sure if I was on. Let me add my welcome to Ellen's. Welcome all to what I think is going to be a fascinating webinar on an extremely important topic. The way we'll do things is that first, I'll speak for a few minutes, just give you a broad overview of the topic, and then Dirk, and then Aldo, and Chris. So we have 3 very distinguished panelists. Dirk is a professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania, and Aldo and Chris are professors of economics, distinguished professors of economics, all 3 of them, at the University of Minnesota. So I think this is going to be an interesting one. What you can do is you will see on your screen a Q&A button that you can press, and you can post questions to the panel. And the basic idea is that some of the questions, especially the co-authors and perhaps on occasion the panelists, may be able to reply live, and others they will defer to the end. We plan to go on until 1:15, but we'll close at 1:15 officially, but if there's still interest, we'll continue beyond 1:15. So with those logistical items aside, let me turn now to a quick introduction. Did I share the screen? I hope I did. Hold on. My use of technology is more limited than it should be. I hope you can all see my screen. Hold on. Okay, all right, that's fine. You'll be able to see the other things as well. Ever since the COVID-19 epidemic struck, especially starting in February and March, as the COVID-19 spread, particularly in Western Europe and then to the United States, there's been an explosion of economics research oriented at marrying models from epidemiology with models from economics to address questions about what the consequences of various policies might be and what optimal policy is going to be like. But before I get to the details of COVID-19, I think it's worthwhile for all of us to remember that the plagues are with us now as much as ever, partly as a consequence of globalization and rapid urbanization, but still much contact with nature, like wet markets in Wuhan. And all of that, I think, implies that we live in a renewed age of epidemics. Indeed, in the last 20 years, we've seen a succession of epidemics: MERS, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, now the novel coronavirus, and so on. And so the obvious questions are, how do we adapt and what policies make sense? I'm reminded of the great economic historian, William McNeill of the University of Chicago, who in his magisterial work of Plagues and Peoples, which is a history of how humanity has dealt with plagues over over thousands of years has pointed out the primary way we adapt to the parasite and the way the parasite adapts to us is by adaptation to each other, by social adaptation of various kinds. And governments obviously nowadays play a very important role. So just to set the stage, because all three of the papers will be dealing with epidemiological formulations that are very similar, the basic starting point of most epidemiology models is that people fall into three kinds of categories. They may be susceptible, infected, or recovered. And recovered could be actually alive and recovered or dead and recovered. And where economics meets epidemiology is that lots of economic transactions have the feature that people must contact each other, must be in physical contact with each other in order to produce economic value. And then that, of course, produces economic value in normal times. In pandemics, what happens is that contact also leads to infection. So the basic idea is that infected people infect susceptible people with some probability in a contact. And so here's a figure just to give you some idea. So there's susceptible, infected, dead, and recovered people. Susceptible people, infected people, and recovered people meet each other in economic transactions, which are mediated through policy and also through private interactions of various kinds. This includes everything from wearing masks to lockdowns and so on. And these contacts, which are denoted in red, induce susceptible people to become infected, and then infected people eventually to either die of the disease or to recover. That's the basic structure of the epidemiology models, and the trade-offs that all three papers will confront are very straightforward. What do we do about these contacts in order to try and trade off economic value that contacts generate against the possibility that some people might die, hospitals might get overloaded, and so on. Having said all that, let me turn it over to Dirk. Now,
I can share my screen. Continue. Here we go. Okay. Can my slides be seen?
yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this is, thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm reporting on a recent project that I've done with Andy Glover, Jonathan Heathcote, and Victor Rios-Roll on COVID-19 and the pandemic. So let me just sort of introduce the topic a bit by talking about the sort of different dimensions that the COVID-19 crisis has, one of which is the health dimension. I will show you some brief data on that. Then in our paper, what we call the wealth dimension is really the real economic consequences of the pandemic, as it has to do with unemployment and the reduction of GDP growth. And that might or might not happen. This might spill over into a banking, finance, and sovereign debt crisis, but I won't say anything about that today. Just to sort of fix ideas. So COVID-19 stands for the coronavirus disease, and that is a disease that's caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. There was a virus SARS-CoV-1 in 2003, so that's the name of the virus, and that causes the disease which we call COVID-19. As of yesterday evening, checking the numbers, there's about 5 million cases worldwide confirmed, and more than 323,000 deaths, according to Johns Hopkins University. And so what this project basically tries to straddle.
Dirk, I don't want to interrupt, but what we are seeing is slides 12 and 13. Do you want us to see those, or do you want us to see slide 1?
Oops. Okay, that is. I want you to see slide 3. So let me see whether I can fix that. Okay, let me stop to share and let's see. Okay. Do you see slide 2 now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So basically, the 3 dimensions that I talked about is the health, the wealth dimension, and then potentially financial crisis, which I'm not going to talk about today. Since yesterday evening, about 5 million confirmed cases in the world, 323,000 deaths. Talking more about the health dimension. So this is a picture that basically shows you the number of daily deaths in the United States. And when I talk about health, I mainly talk about daily death because confirmed cases, there's significant measurement error issues. So I will focus on daily deaths. And what you see in this picture is that the first death emerged in the United States roughly around the mid of March. Around March 22nd, states started to lock down part of their economies. You see first initial exponential increase in the number of daily deaths. Then that stabilizes around 2,000 deaths per day. And since then, there has been a slight decline. So this is a massive health crisis, which, however, and that's important for my project, doesn't affect everybody equally. If you actually look at where these deaths occur and how they're distributed. So this is data from New York City up until mid-May, and it breaks down the number of deaths by age groups. And what you can see is very clearly is that if you are in ages between 0 and say 45, you're most likely, even if you contract the virus, you're not going to die from it. On the other hand, most of the deaths in New York City, and this is true more generally, occur among the population that is 75 years or older. That's about 50% of all deaths in New York City accounted by those individuals, and 25% of those dying are accounted for by people 65 to 74, leaving the rest of the death to younger individuals. So even though this is a massive health crisis when it comes to death, they are very heavily concentrated among the elderly, which means that any type of economic policy that reduces economic activity to reduce these deaths, the benefits of those are going to be heavily tilted towards the elderly as well. The second dimension of the crisis is the economic dimension. I'm sure you have seen these pictures. If you look at new unemployment claims, they are pretty stable for quite a long time. And if you just look at the height of the Great Recession, and we call the Great Recession because it's a really big recession between 2007 and 2009. This was about 650,000. So that was at the peak of the Great Recession. Now, if you turn to April 2020, you get initial unemployment claims about 10 times as large. So that shows you the magnitude of the current economic crisis induced by the health crisis and induced by the ensuing lockdowns. At this point, we have some data. We have some data on unemployment itself. This is the unemployment rate, seasonally adjusted from the United States, hovering around 4%. And then COVID-19 hits, and the unemployment rate shoots up to about 15% in April. And even that is probably an understatement of how problematic the labor market is, because this comes against the background of an historically low labor force participation rate. So the share of people working or actively looking for a job is now at 60%, which is the lowest since the 1970s. So the very high unemployment rate even understates how bad the current labor market in the United States looks like. When it comes to economic production, we don't know how things look, but certainly the first quarter of 2020 was pretty bad, with the GDP growth estimated to be in the order of about -5%. And if you think that's bad, you haven't seen anything yet. The second quarter is meant to be awful. The best estimates that I could find estimate something around the decline in GDP in the order between 25 and 30%, of course, with a very large standard error. So it could be 20%, it could be 40%, but the estimates range around 25 to 30% in terms of the decline in terms of real economic activity. So what we do in this paper, we take these two dimensions of the crisis, the health dimension and the economic dimension, and ask, in the backdrop of this, how extensive should be the macroeconomic shutdown of the economy when you take into account the distributional consequences of the shutdown. Why distributional consequences? Because what I talked about so far is I showed you that the benefits of an economic shutdown are disproportionately towards the older population whose incidence of dying is going to be reduced. On the other hand, the economic costs of an economic shutdown is concentrated among young households still in the labor market, and among those, especially those working in sectors that are subject to the economic shutdown. If you do a partial economic shutdown, you have to deal with these people, possibly by redistributing resources to them. So therefore, what this project tries to do, it tries to analyze optimal macroeconomic shutdown policy and optimal distributional policy at the same time, because if you have a shutdown, you have to deal with the people that have reduced incomes due to unemployment, and that's what we try to do in this project. So broadly speaking, we follow exactly the research strategy that Chari outlined. We combine an epidemiological model with a very simple model of the macroeconomies. People in the model are going to be heterogeneous, and therefore there's scope for redistribution. And then we assess the optimal combination of two types of policy: shutdown policies that reduce economic activity to curb the spreading out of the epidemic, and at the same time redistribution policy that deals with the drop in incomes of those whose jobs have disappeared. And the key interaction between these two policies is that if you do a large economic shutdown, that reduces the number of people that are out of work, that increases the need for redistribution. But if redistribution is costly, that might reduce the appetite of the policymaker to engage in costly redistribution. So let me briefly talk about the details. So our model has two components, as I said: a health part and epidemiological part, which is a variant of the simple SEIR model that Chari has talked about. Just to recall, the simple SEIR model has three groups of people. S people, these are people that have not yet been infected. They are susceptible to the disease. Then infected people that currently have the disease, that currently are infected, carry the virus. And then recovered people. Recovered people can be either people that have had the disease, are now immune to it, or it could be people that have had the disease and are now dead. From the perspective of the mathematics of the model, there's no distinction between these two groups. Of course, from an economic welfare point of view, of course, there's a big distinction between those that are recovered and those that are dead. Our innovation in this realm is to break up the infected people into three subgroups: those that are infected but are symptomatic. So these people have the virus but don't show any symptoms. They might not even know that they have the disease. Then those people that are infected but have flu-like symptoms. So these are people that are slightly sick. And then then E people, these are people that are more severely sick. They need emergency care, and then they might recover from that, or they might die. So the worst possible disease progression in our model is from susceptible, meaning from healthy without having had the disease, towards contracting the disease but having no symptoms, towards getting slight symptoms, towards getting more severe symptoms, towards dying. But in every step of this progression, households might recover from that, and with high probability do so. Why do we model these three different types of people separately? Asymptomatic, flu people, and people with emergency room care, because they have different propensities and different ways to spread the disease, and especially the asymptomatic. They spread the disease while being at work and while consuming, meaning they spread the disease through economic interactions. That's where we come in as economists. And this is exactly where a partial economic lockdown might be effective to stop spreading the disease from the asymptomatic to those people that have not had the disease yet. So the main purpose of a lockdown is stopping the spreading of the disease from those that have contracted it but have no symptoms towards those that are still susceptible to the disease. Okay. The economic part is very simple. We distinguish people between young and old. The main distinction between the young and the old is that the young work and therefore have the possibility to contract the virus at work and during consumption. The old individuals do not work and therefore are less prone to contracting the disease, but conditional on contracting the disease, the key problem of the old is that if they contract the disease, they're much more likely to die from it, because that's what the health economy, what the health individuals tell us that is the characteristics of this disease. Then young households produce, and they produce in two sectors. The first sector is a sector that is not subject to any lockdown. This is the essential sector like healthcare and food production that you have to have, and there's no question that you shut down the sector. And also households, individuals that work in this sector have no risk of becoming unemployed through an economic shutdown. On the other hand, they have a larger risk of being infected from the disease. And then there's a group of individuals that work in what we call the luxury sectors, restaurants, entertainment sector, and the like. These are the people that carry the main economic burden of the shutdown. But on the other hand, if they are shut down, the probability of contracting the disease and getting sick is reduced. And these are also the individuals to whom you have to transfer resources because they become unemployed when there's a partial shutdown in the economy. The thought experiment that we conduct in this economy, so we take this model, we nail it to the data up until April 12th. So we make sure that our model resembles the US economy up until April 12th, and then we play policymaker, and we look at 3 different shutdown scenarios. The baseline scenario is one where everything looks like April 12th, and then the lockdown, which we estimate to be about 50% of the non-essential sector, remains in place until June 30. That's our best guess of how current lockdown policies will unfold. We contrast that to a policy where on the morning of April 13, the economy is completely opened up. That's the opening on Easter scenario. As you might recall, that initially was one scenario that was touted by the president. And the third scenario is an optimal lockdown scenario, where on April 12th, the policymaker gets to choose optimally how much of a lockdown to have going forward and how long that lockdown is to last. And optimal here means maximizing weighted sum of well-being of these 3 groups, the old, the young in the luxury sector, and the young in the basic sector. And for all 3 policy combinations, we show what happens to the health side, to the economic side, and ultimately to welfare. So let me show you some brief results. So what I've shown here is the health side of the model. So what this panel in the upper left corner shows, this is the daily deaths in the US economy under the baseline scenario, which is the red line. What this shows you is that the number of daily death increases as in the data up until April 12th. Then we introduce these partial lockdown in the second half of March. That stabilizes daily death at around 2,000, and the number of daily death goes down. Then we open up the economy the end of June, and we're going to get an increase in daily death towards about 4,000 per day as a consequence of the opening up on June 29th. One thing I want to highlight, comparing the red line in the total population to the red line down here, which is the death of old people. If you compare the number, 2,000 overall, close to 2,000 among the old people, that just shows you that the overwhelming majority of the deaths are accounted for by people that are 65 and older. Compare that to the blue line, where on Easter we would have opened up the economy completely. You get a massive explosion of the daily death from 2,000 to about 11,000. And again, most of these deaths are accounted by the elderly. So this is the comparison of the scenario where we maintain the lockdown until the end of June towards a scenario where on Easter we open up unmitigated. This, according to our simulations, would have induced a massive increase in the number of daily deaths, mainly driven by the daily death of old people. It would have overwhelmed the medical system, and the associated welfare costs are costing a bunch of extra life, mainly among the old among the old people. If you measure the total share of people that never get the disease, in the benchmark model, the number of people that don't have the disease goes from 100% early on the epidemic, nobody has the disease, to about 30% in the long run, meaning 70% in the long run have contracted the disease at some point. If you don't mitigate, that number goes down, meaning it is the case that with more stringent mitigation, less people contract the disease. But on the other hand, the gap between these two policies is not very large, meaning then ultimately lockdown policies will not reduce by a large degree the people that will ever have had the disease, and also will not largely reduce the number of eventual deaths. It just will postpone when these deaths occurs, and the hope is that at some point there's going to be a vaccine. But other than that, mitigation will postpone deaths, but not necessarily reduce the number of deaths. A little bit of that will happen, but not to the largest degree. Okay. Now let's ask these groups of people, what would you prefer in terms of optimal policy? I have 4 lines here, and this is basically the answer to the question: to the old, to the young that work in the non-essential sector, to the young that work in the basic sector. How large should be the lockdown and how long should it last? So take this line here. This is for the old. If you ask the olds, they would say that on April 12th, we should, relative to the lockdown in place, we should reduce the magnitude of the lockdown, but we should keep it high very much into the fall. And the main argument for the old is that, well, we are the main beneficiaries of lockdown policies because it saves our life and expectations. But on the other hand, are there economic costs to it that will reduce economic output, since most of our consumption will come from transfers from the young. The size of the lockdown is perhaps too large right now. But on the other hand, we want to keep it for a longer period of time in order for us to have a better chance of surviving COVID-19 until a vaccine is being developed. If on the other hand, you ask the luxury workers, these are the people that are mainly at economic risk of being laid off because the economy is locked down. They want to have less of a lockdown, and they want to have opening up much more rapidly. And again, this just comes from the fact that for them, they also value not getting sick. But on the other hand, their risk of getting sick, severely sick, is much reduced, and the economic cost is much more direct for those individuals. So that's where you see the conflict between the old that want a large and longer lasting lockdown relative to the workers in the non-essential sector that want less of a lockdown, and they want this lockdown to last less long. So in fact, you can actually ask of how much would you be willing to pay in terms of consumption to get these policies. If you ask how much is it worth to you to get the optimal policy, we have an optimal policy. I mean, the blue line, which is just a weighted policy of what's optimal for the old versus the young. And what you find is that the old very much value lockdowns that last for quite a while. They are willing to pay 4% in terms of permanent consumption for it. For the young people working in the non-essential sector, they also benefit a little bit from that policy, but not nearly as much. And if you were to implement a policy that the old guys like, namely very extended lockdowns that last into the fall, that's a policy where young luxury workers actually would lose relative to a world where you open up the economy immediately. So these numbers show the very strong conflict of interest between the old that needs strong mitigation that lasts for a long period of time, and the young people working in the non-essential sector that rather want to have short-lasting lockdowns that don't last for a long period of time. I think given the time, I should be short here. Now, the optimal mitigation strategy changes quite substantially. If somebody could guarantee us that we would have a vaccine within 6 months, suppose somebody tells us that by October 12th, meaning 6 months after April 12th, we for sure are going to have a vaccine. Then the optimal policy changes drastically, and you're going to get much more mitigation, much stronger mitigation now relative to the world of no vaccine? And the answer, the reason is very clear. If you know you're going to have a vaccine quickly, then it's optimal to basically write it out, shut the economy down to a large extent, and then make sure that everybody gets vaccinated. If you don't know that the vaccine is coming, the best thing you can do with a partial lockdown is postponing the number of deaths, but not avoiding them. And then at some point you have to eat them up. And that's why without a vaccine, or with a vaccine in 3 or 4 years, you're going to get a lockdown that's much less severe relative to a world where somebody could guarantee you that in the fall we have a vaccine. Then the optimal thing, especially for the old guys, is to say, look, let us bridge over the period up until we get the vaccine, and let's lock the economy to a very large extent to basically get there. And there's huge conflict of interest when it comes to those policies. The old guys very much would prefer such a policies, whereas when you ask the young guys that are locked out, that face substantial amount of unemployment, these individuals clearly do not like these policies very, very much. So let me conclude. Our results suggest that substantial shutdowns were optimal. These shutdowns should last well into the fall, but the size of the lockdown was perhaps suboptimally large. And the key message that I want to emphasize is the welfare implications of these policies are very, very uneven, with the big beneficiaries of these policies are the old, whom you keep alive, whereas the main potential losers of the reform are people that are young, that work in non-essential sectors, and that bear the brunt of the potential unemployment, increase in unemployment rate that these lockdowns entail. And like with any good economic model that I've learned as a student in Minnesota, the results are somewhat sensitive to what you stick into the model, and I've listed here the main parameters to which our results depend upon. How much do you actually value life? How important is economic activity in the transmission of the disease? And how likely is it that once you contract the disease, how likely is that you actually die from it? And how heterogeneous is that across young and old?
Thank you, Dirk. That was wonderful. That's great. As a young person, I got to say, I'm not that interested in the lives of old people. Aldo, you wanna take over? You can share screen and we'll move right along.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll just. Okay.
Wonderful.
So that's what I want to talk about. Is co-authored with two old friends that live in Italy, Carlo Favera and Andrea Ichino. I will concentrate on data from Italy. This is going to be very data-driven, so I'll stay close to the data as much as the data let me, or let us. We don't have much data, so we use those that we have in the best possible way. We study Italian experience and we focus on two regions that are at the center of the epidemic, Lombardia and Veneto. They're both in the north. And to keep your interest going, I have to say that these are two regions in Italy that are very similar to Minnesota. So for instance, the GDP per capita is $41,000 in Lombardia compared to the $53,000 in Minnesota. So it's not the same, but we are close. The size of the population is similar. Lombardia is 10 million, Veneto 5, and Minnesota is about 6. Both regions also have a very advanced healthcare system. It's different from ours. It's a public healthcare. It's organized at the regional level. There is no Mayo Clinic in Lombardia, but there are centers of excellence which are comparable to that. So these are the similarities. There are There are differences. One is population density. Milano is about 8,000 people per square kilometer. Minneapolis is 3,000. So very high urban density in Milano. Transportation, which is one of the main bottleneck in the fight of the virus and its economic implication, is public and mass transportation. People move with light rail, subway, buses. In a few words, Northern Italy, Milan in particular, can be defined as pandemic-friendly environments. So that's the difference. Italy, the reason why Italy can be useful for people who live in Minnesota is that Italy had a very early start, even compared to New York City. So it provides an idea of what is lying ahead. Two key dates here are March 10 or February 21st, where the first scale was detected in Italy. March 10, it went very quickly. March 10, there was the first lockdown. It was March 8 in Lombardia, and March 10 it was extended to the entire Italy, and it lasted approximately 2 months, and there is a progressive moderate reopening which started on May 4th. This to give you an idea of how things went. These are the daily fatalities. How many dead people are from COVID causes in Lombardia and in Veneto. The two vertical lines are the two dates I was mentioning earlier. One is the March 8th for Lombardia, and this one is the May 4th, the reopening of Italy. The March 8th lockdown was immediately followed up by a lockdown of Italy. As you see, kept the daily fatalities, which is the data, the figure which is most reliable in this case, kept going up, reached the peak approximately when it was expected to reach the peak, around March 23rd, stalled for a while. This created a panic and then eventually started to slow down. Now it's lower, it's around 50 to 75, and has not yet started to creep up. The important thing that you see from this graphic gives you an idea that is the reason why we concentrate on Lombardia and Veneto. Some people in Italy called about the Veneto model. The blue line is Lombardia, the black line is Veneto. Remember, Lombardia has twice as many people living there, but only twice as many. The outcome in terms of that is really different. So there is a very important lesson to be learned here. The two health systems reacted in a very different way, and the performance has been, as you can see, very different. It's an important lesson hidden there. Fatalities, as of yesterday, there were 32,000 dead, which is the tragedy. The important factor has already been highlighted, is of these 32,000, under 50, there are 262. You have to go over 5,000, you have to go to the age 70. So this is clear now, but it was clear already from the Chinese data. So when we started to think about it, we said, everybody understands that there is a trade-off between what do we do to fight the spread of the virus and the damage that we do to the economy. But the good news in all this tragic news is that the productive part of the country is relatively safe. If you look below 50%, 50 years of age, the probability of contracting a serious disease from COVID is really small. So we thought that any sensible policy should leverage this fact. To my profound amazement, this very simple, very basic, very reasonable idea is impervious to the mind of Italian politicians. That's my tragic experience in this case. Let's see what we can learn from this. So that's what I said. In view of this age difference, don't use indiscriminate lockdown. Don't keep everybody at home. Differentiate working activity according to age, and be extremely careful for the older age, because that's where most of the victims are going to be. Now, I'm sure most of you are already coming up with the questions in your mind. Well, it's easy for you to say, how do we know it works? If you send the young people out to work, they can be infected, and when they go back home or they are on the metro or on the bus, they infect other people. It's all very difficult. And so it's easy for you to say, but maybe it doesn't work. And even if it does work, how much does it do? Does it work? So that's what we try to do. We really try to put numbers in this trade-off. I think everybody understands that, that there is this compromise possible. Send the young people to work, keep the older people safe. How much do you have to gain for this? So we develop a model, but as I said, we try to stay as close as possible to the data. We calibrate, so we estimate a model of the spread of the virus in a population that has these three important features. The infection risks depend on the age, the sector where they work may also affect the probability according to which they transmit infection and they receive infection. If you work in the agricultural sector, and most of it, you are less likely to infect other people as compared to, say, whether you work in the retail sector. And then the crucial point, which everybody understood, at the beginning people were suggesting the idea maybe we should let herd immunity go on. This idea clashed very quickly into the dramatic fact that most of the people that were getting sick to the point of needing intensive care unity. The intensive care treatment was limited, this bottleneck was reached, and a large number of deaths was ensuing. This was different from other pandemics that have occurred because it has this specific feature. So we take this specific feature very much into account. The number of intensive care units that are available in a country, in a region. So that's the model we use. I just want to look at it. The next two slides are just to say there is a big engine under the hood, really, which I have no time, not even to hint at. There is susceptibles, exposed, infected, they split into three groups, and so on and go on. But we have to keep track very carefully, not only of who is infecting whom, but how quickly and how fast this virus is spreading so that the hospitals get overcrowded, which was really the dramatic lesson that we learned in Lombardia. And we did not happen in Veneto. That's the main difference. And to take into account, the next slide is even more complicated, but to take into account the differences in age from the point of view of the productive sector, we generalize a number, which is the basic reproduction number. I was hoping the people before me would mention it, but the basic reproduction number is telling how many people on average during the course of the disease an infected person infects. So if the reproduction number is 3, that means that an infected person will on average infect 3 more people. And of course you understand that if it is 3, the spread is going to be exponential. If it is less than 1, will contract. The key insight that we use here is, if you're staring at this matrix, let me help you. We split the population into 19 groups, 0 to 10, very young, 10 to 20, a bit older, and then into active and inactive, and then the active according to the age, 20 to 30, 20 to 40, and so on, and according to the sector, whether it is low risk or high risk. We would have loved to have even more detailed description, but that's what we have in the data. We already have to scrape the barrel to get this, but we got good estimates of really. So for instance, this number here, 153, says that a young man in the low risk of 2030 is infecting a similar person to him, same age, and but in the high risk at this rate, and so on. So Every number in this matrix is telling how much a person in the row is infecting a person described in the column. Okay, it's crucial. I hope this is not too mysterious, but we really have to explode this single number that you hear around. R0 is 1, is less than 1, is more than 2. We have to split it into a matrix, which is not this array of numbers, which is 19 times 19. Once we have that, we plug that into the epidemiological model, and we can compute with a much higher degree of accuracy what are the economic implications of different policies. For instance, we can decide all the young people below 50 go back to work, all those above do not. Then this matrix is going to tell us how quickly the infection is spreading. And I'll give you an application, interesting application. But that's the main idea. What happens if we instead we send also only people below the age of 40? Or what if we go to the age of 60? Or what if we exclude the sector that is high risk? And we can get different answers, which are on two important outcomes. One is the number of dead that you have at the end of the period, and the other one is the loss in GDP that you have. We compared our model with the data. They are almost indistinguishable. Anyway, the blue line is the simulated, the black line is the real. They match very close. We don't change much the parameters. Top is Lombardia, bottom Veneto. And more crucially, we do this in a daily basis. You see, the evolution is very different in Lombardia and Veneto, but we are able to capture it. The main reason is that we take into account the constraint that regions have on the intensive care unit. Once we do that, then, this is, in fact, here is a slide that maybe I should rush through this, that illustrates that the red line, which is how many intensive care units you have available, really determines the dynamic in the following days. So here is the bottom line, the virtue of policy differentiation. We should differentiate according to age. What we aim to do is to study the trade-off for different policies for these two basic outcomes that are relevant. They are both bad. One is the number of fatalities, and the other is the number of the fraction of GDP loss. And since they are both bad, we try to minimize. And we understand that there is a compromise, and we trace this compromise you will see in an illuminating picture, I see. So, and we will consider all possible policies. So I told you some of these policies, and they are illustrated here. All means everybody goes back to work. Lock means we continue the lockdown. And age, we only send workers that are younger than 50. And SEC, we only send workers that work in the less risky sector back to work. The exercise is we start the policy on May 4th, 2020, and on May 2021, we see how it went. The idea is that by that time, our forecasts are useless because either there is a vaccine or a remedy or something else has happened. Okay, so that's the problem. If you follow me so far, here is what is the menu. Here is what we told politicians. You can choose from this. So let me explain. On the horizontal axis, there is the GDP loss. So the smaller GDP, the better it is. This is a loss of 5%. And on the vertical line is the number of total fatalities. We are looking at Lombardia. Lombardia has had so far about 13,000 fatalities. These are fatalities that would add to those that already exist in the period from May 4, 2020 to May 4, 2021. And you see, this is the trade-off. You can choose any of these. And there are also other policies that are here that we don't draw in the part of the diagram that you don't see because they are words. In our technical jargon is they are not efficient because there is a policy that has, if you have a policy that gives you an outcome here higher up, there is a policy among those that are feasible that gives you less dead people and a smaller fraction of GDP loss. Let me point out a few remarkable things. One is that the curve is substantially flat until a loss of 5%. And then it picks up in terms of fatality. So gaining, I'm saying, reducing the loss of GDP here doesn't cost much in terms of dead. Reducing the GDP loss here, it costs very little. This may have looked mysterious to some, but the explanation is very simple. If you start from the policy that says we continue the lockdown, if you keep everybody at home, and then you start putting people to work, of course, you first send to work the young, so they are not affected very much. But then as you go up here, you start sending the older, and then you start paying a lot in terms of fatalities. That's the best argument we have in terms of the age differentiation. We have an application for the opening of school very quickly because I'm running out of time. Schools in Italy are currently closed. Teaching is all online. On the other hand, either now or later in the fall, school have to be open, otherwise people cannot realistically go back to work. So you have to open the schools some way or another. The obvious lesson that comes from what I try to explain is that you should only send people who are older, who are younger. Unfortunately, the teaching class, the teachers in Italy are somewhat older. So you should differentiate between the two. This seems to me an obvious, this seems to us an obvious policy prescription. We even told the politicians, look, this is what our simulation model says. This is how we match the data. The blue line is the number of fatalities that you have if you open the school only using young teachers. The red line is what happens if you send all the teachers back to school. So between these two evils, the three evils of not opening the school, which is really not possible, sending everybody to teach or making the selection, the difference is huge in terms of, it's about 150 number of dead people per day. So it's a huge cost. This seems common sense. As I said, it seems hard to communicate. Let me conclude. Continuation of lockdown, don't even think about it, is too costly. Prudent policies are possible and may save many lives. I told you exactly how many. And you have to be careful to stay away from that kink where the number of dead people goes up dramatically. That's it. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aldo. That's wonderful. That's great. Chris, you're up.
All right, let me share the screen. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. So our provocative title is The Hammer and the Scalpel on the Economics of Indiscriminate versus Targeted Isolation Policies During Pandemics. All titles need to have a colon in them. All right, I want to do 3 quotes. There's a common quote: if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the unknown for that is, who knows who first said that. Second quote is, if all you have is a hammer and you really do need to do something, you will use the hammer. That quote is from me. Third quote is, if all you have is a hammer and you really do need to do something, buy some other tools quickly, if only for the next time. And that's getting at what Chari was talking about, that this is not the last epidemic we're going to face. And so what I mean, right now there's 1 million economists, and by the way, I don't think I'm going to use my 15 minutes. We're going to get a lot of good questions and answers from this. Obviously, this is hyperbole. There are a lot of economists now working on models which include epidemiology and allow the consideration of economic trade-offs. That's a great thing. This is the most important economic event that's happened probably since the Great Depression. This is what we should be spending our time on. Most use a variant of the standard SIR model where Chari was talking about S stands for susceptible, people who haven't been exposed to this disease yet. Infected, people who currently have the disease are running around infecting other people. And recovered, who people have made it through this disease. They call it the SAFER model with Dirk and co-authors. Everything is a variant of this model that I've seen, one way or another. All of the models out there, I believe, correctly recognize that economic activity creates both infections and goods and services. This shows up in Aldo's model. It shows up in Dirk's model and co-authors. That's what creates the trade-off. If you allow people to bump into each other and create economic activity, they're also bumping into each other, transmitting a virus. But there's not, and it's not, this is not to fault any other any other economists. There's no standard policy tool set on what policymakers can do about the trade-off. There's not an agreed upon tool set for a simple reason. We've only been working on this for 8 weeks or something like that. Sometimes the only tool considered is a hammer, and I think that this is more of a criticism not of other economists, but of policymakers. The hammer that they consider is shutting everything down. That's or various, I would call, undifferentiated policies. So our contribution, and other people are working on this too, is really a first attempt to realistically introduce, and that we hope is on the realistically, a finer tool set. And specifically, it's to introduce an informative signal in testing. And so the idea I want to get at is when somebody is tested for coronavirus, at least in the beginning of this thing, they were only testing people who they pretty much knew already had it. They're in the hospital, they're in intensive care, they need to be intubated or something like that. And that was just used as confirmation. And Chari and I had an op-ed in the beginning of April, was it, Chari? Yeah, it was the beginning of April where we said that's kind of a waste of a test. You shouldn't necessarily be testing people who just to confirm what you already know. A place like South Korea, they're getting hit rates on their testing of about 2% or less. They're testing people and about 1.8%, I think, show up positive. But the population fraction in South Korea is a whole lot less than 1.8%. So the people that are being tested are somehow being, this is what I mean by an informative signal. Even though the fraction of people who end up being positive in South Korea is quite low, between 1.5% and 2%, it's still multiples higher than the positive rate they would get if they just chose South Koreans completely at random and tested them. So that's what I mean by they have a reason for testing who they're testing, and that's actually a pretty good reason. They're getting a much higher hit rate than if they tested people at random. So that's what we want to see, which is once you give policymakers this tool set of, well, the informative signal is not a tool set. That's something that we just think is naturally there. And you can test people based on the informative tool set. How does this change our recommendations of things like how long to lock down and so forth? What we don't have is any kind of, what Dirk and Aldo have are people of different ages. We don't have anything like that to our discredit. Let me give our main results as follows. Relative to doing nothing, optimal policy using only an indiscriminate lockdown has a 0.6% welfare gain. So we put everything in terms of welfare gains because we're starting with, well, what if you do nothing? And what we find is similar to other economists' work on this in the last 8-10 weeks, that yeah, doing nothing is probably not the best thing to do. And specifically, if all you can do is indiscriminately shut down economic activity, you actually do want to use that tool. That was the second made-up quote of mine, which was, if all you have is a hammer and you really need to do something, you probably should use the hammer. The second main finding that we have is something we call an intermediate tool, the knife, which is, suppose there are no tests, but there are people that you would test if you could test. There are people out there who, you know, they just had lunch with their brother and their brother's in the hospital with something that looks like COVID. Well, maybe you just want to isolate people who you would test if you could test. That actually has a much bigger gain. That's actually a useful tool to have, just knowing who you would test if you could test. And then the third one we do is optimal policy, allowing the discriminate isolation of those who you test because you would test if you could test, and you can test, so you do. And then you isolate the people who test positive. That has the biggest welfare gain. But the point we want to have is you get kind of halfway there, or even more than halfway there, just by isolating the people who, if you could test, you would test, which we think is novel to us. So as usual, our states are, for us, if you start off being susceptible, and then somehow you become infected. And if you're infected, at least for one period, which to us is a week, you're infected and nobody knows you're infected, including even yourself. And you can go around and infect other people. And then with some probability, you develop the disease and become known infected, or maybe you just get over it one way or another. And again, we do the same thing that everyone else does. If you're recovered and alive, you can't spread the disease to someone else. If you're recovered and dead, you can't spread the disease to someone else. It doesn't affect the epidemiology whether you're dead or not. It does affect the economic costs and benefits. So our model is pretty simple. Like I just said, the unknown infected become known infected with some exogenous probability, and they recover with some exogenous probability. The known infected recover with some exogenous probability. We do something that we think is different than others, which is we take life's stuff and divide it into what we call activity types. And activity types affect two things: the probability that you actually transfer the disease if you meet with somebody in activity I, and the benefit to society of that. So a susceptible person in activity type I gets affected with a probability which depends on some underlying technical transmission rate for that activity. And so I wrote Zumba versus Pilates, because in South Korea they found out doing Zumba, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which requires a lot of vigorous exertion and your breath is going out. That infected everybody in the room. And then that class ended, a 4-hour class for Zumba instructors taught by a master Zumba instructor. Everybody gets infected. And then the next class was Pilates, which I've never done, but it doesn't require very much exertion. Nobody gets infected. Even though the same room, everybody got infected a half hour previous. So it does seem like certain activities infect people more than others. One of the tools that we give society is we assume that once a person recovered, you know it. And so you can say, look, this activity is allowed to be done by people who have recovered, but this activity is not. You can differentiate based on that. And we assume that if somebody's in the ICU or is just known to have a fever or something like that, that you just keep them from doing any activity at all. But by this, we do what everybody else does, which is that there's a way of just working out the math, saying how many people are going to be infected tomorrow as a function of everything today. If there are no signal and no testing, the only tools you have is you can restrict the amount, and this is what I'm going to call a hammer, is you can restrict the amount of activity in each activity I. Now, at least you can sit there and say, okay, no Zumba classes, but Pilates classes. No rock concerts, but you can be out on the beach. All right, we allow that. And this doesn't make much difference. You can say, okay, this activity can only be done by people who we know not to be able to be infected anymore. With signals and testings, we say, okay, policymakers receive a signal, just something that says this person has a higher probability of being infected than the baseline probability. So there's some probability theta I, which is the probability of just receiving some flag, I'll call it. You know, a little light goes off that says this person got a signal, and there's some probability that signal happens for a susceptible person. And I want you to think of this as kind of being a false negative, and this is being a true positive. And we just assume that you only test people with signals and that the test is good. That if a person, it tells you this person really didn't have it, this person did have it. The production side of the economy, we assume a convex cost of testing. We assume that known infected people don't produce. And this is the big economic assumption. The production of good I is proportional to the number of meetings of type I. Meat packing is both an activity and a good, you know, pork. Our welfare calculations are not going to be much different than everyone else. Consumption is good, and that's just how much you produce minus testing cost. We put in there in our welfare calculations some cost to people dying. We put in there in our welfare calculations some cost to people getting sick. And we put in the welfare calculations some cost to testing people. And this is what we get. And Chari, just jump in, hit your space bar if I mess this up like I did the last time we presented this. What is optimal policy if all you can do is a hammer? And what we tried to do is match it to the other people in the literature that have done these things. We chose our parameters to try to get answers that were in line with what everybody else did. In particular, you get this massive spike in infections if you do nothing. If all you do, we put also in this one is, what do you do if you can just do untargeted testing? You just randomly take people and test them. It doesn't do that much. So I'm going to just basically ignore everything but the black lines, which is what do you do if, no, black line is no policy. Green line is no testing. So the black line is if you just do nothing. The green line is if you use the hammer and you use it. You get less, it's good to use it. You get less people infected and you get a big recession. So the black line is the size of the recession if you don't do anything. And this red and green line is the size of the recession optimally. And so we get what others get. If all you have is a hammer, you create a bigger recession than if you just let things go. And you get less infections, fewer infections. So then we said, okay, well, let's add this testing thing. Well, the question is, how do you pin down these signals? How do we know what numbers to stick in? And Dirk mentioned this, which is it's going to be sensitive to it. All right, so one of the things you do when your model is sensitive to your parameters is you put in a bunch of different parameters and you let the reader see what you get. But you have to have a starting point. And so we tried to use South Korea as a starting point for what we call our baseline estimate. And so what do we know about South Korea? Well, its positive test rate is 1.8%, and that's 86 times the population infection rate. It's a pretty informative signal. And we also know that they've tested about 1.2% of the population. And if you write a couple of equations and a couple of unknowns, you can use that to trick out what you should make theta I and theta S. And so we said, basically there's this signal that if it pops up for somebody, they're a 38% chance of being positive. But if they're actually not infectious, there's still a probability that they're going to get the signal. We give results for much less effective signals as well. And what we get is you use the knife if you have the knife. You use the scalpel if you have the scalpel. So what we get here, targeted means the blue line is you test people and you isolate people who test positive. And you get a much lower infection peak and you get a much smaller recession than if all that you have is a hammer. So the red here is the size of the recession that you induce. I mean, you induce the recession because it's the only way to fight this. If that's the only way to fight it, if you can use a better instrument, you use the better instrument and you get a much shallower optimal recession. And you get bigger welfare gains. Put this in table form because I think I'm running out of time. By definition, the welfare gain of doing nothing is 0. The welfare gain from using only shutting down economic activity is about 0.6%. The welfare gain from using every tool that we give you is 3%. And the welfare gain of just locking up those people who you would test if you could test is still pretty big.
Thank you. Right.
So the conclusion is there's big gains, welfare gains from targeted testing and isolation if there's a good signal. What matters is having an informative, now this I didn't show you, but it's true. What really matters is having an informative signal of who's infected. False positives are actually not that big of a deal. The only real cost to a false positive is you lock somebody up, is the testing cost. So really what's important is the signal. And let's see if I have another slide. No, that's it.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. Much appreciated. We are pretty much at 1:15. So what we will do is those participants who have other urgent commitments, they can and they will of course leave. But what we'll do is we'll continue with a few questions, and at this point we welcome live questions as well. So send me a message in the Q&A that you want to go live, and we'll try and get you on live. But let me start with some questions which were in the Q&A box, which I think are of general interest. First, this is mainly for Aldo and Carlo and Andrea. Fascinating stuff that you presented on the extraordinary differences between Lombardia and Veneto. I think excited a lot of people who were participating and who wanted more information about what your guess is on why you get such large differences between these. Either of the three of you, any of the three of you. You may have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's a delicate issue. So Veneto had a much more, he had larger foresight. They started to accumulate the tests for the virus very early on. They started in January, thanks to the intelligence of some people at the University of Padua first. So they were ready when it started. When it started, they studied very well one of the cities in which this event happened, and they inferred a lot of information from that. Third, they had a much better strategy in handling the hospitals. They didn't let the infection spread within the hospitals, which unfortunately happened in Lombardia. And third, thanks to all this, they didn't panic, so they were much better able to manage to go to a strategy that is now beginning to be common to both Lombardia and Veneto. So looking at the data now, we see there is a convergence of the way of handling the spread of the virus in the direction of the Veneto model. Which the basic ideas are this: trace people very soon. If they are not too serious, keep them at home. Don't bring them to the hospital. Start treating them. The treatment is Plaquenil, is known under a different name in the United States, but it's the brand name, that is hydroxychloroquine. and which is effective, and use the hospitals only when it's strictly necessary. So Veneto has never hit in a serious way the constraint of the number of intensive care units available. So better first, they were better able to predict, better able to organize the response, decentralize it, don't crowd the hospitals. Also, don't have a transportation system that depends on the metro, on the subway, don't have a very crowded city, don't do mistakes early on.
Okay.
Don't have a pandemic-friendly environment, I think is the best advice you can get.
So this is a question really for Dirk and Jonathan and Victor and Andy Glover, I think. One kind of question which showed up in the question and answer thing is that even absent any intervention, you might expect that people will take various defensive measures. Indeed, they seem to do it well before, at least a week or two before the lockdowns happened in the United States. People stopped going to restaurants to a significant extent and so on. And this has substantial implications for the nature of the recovery. So what's your guess about what would happen if you introduce those kinds of forces into your model? How much of these lockdowns it has to be a consequence of policy, and how much do you think will voluntarily be done by firms and households and others in the process of doing business? I know it's a little bit of a curveball, but you guys are way up there, so you should be able to handle it.
Well, I can tell you, there's a little bit of that in the model, in the sense, and Dirk and Andy correct me if I speak too much. There is a little bit of that in the model already. Our estimates postulated that there was a change in behavior around March 21st. That implied that the fundamentals of interaction between people went from a 3.5 to a 1.2 R0 as being the basic of everyday behavior. On top of that, we added a mild, we added some mitigation after that. So a way to think of what we're doing is we're thinking of this on top of the reasonable behavior that was self-enforced to self-implemented around late March. Now, what we haven't done is to think that social distancing in place voluntarily without government intervention might imply some drastic loss of output, some drastic needs of reallocation, might leave some sectors out in the lurch without any purchases of their goods and services. That's we haven't done, but that somewhere is already there.
Just to follow up on that.
Sure.
So I would say, I mean, we start the model sort of middle of February and try to describe what happens in the US up until April 12th fairly accurately. And one thing that we did learn that it's very hard to describe those 2 months without a very substantial fall in R0. And so our model reproduces that. And if you take this to be a measure of part of this being driven by changes in social behavior, that we have that in. And in fact, in order to match the data, we in fact need that. And if you think about the timing, a lot of these adjustments happened prior to states starting to lock down, sometimes the 3rd week of March. That's exactly what we need in the model in order to get the data prior to that right. Otherwise, it would be very hard for our model to match the data without that change in social behavior that then leads to a very substantial reduction in R0.
Okay, this is, I guess, in the interest of fairness, let me pose this to Chris, though I think that all the authors might want to speak on this. So I'll pose in a somewhat provocative fashion. Until recently, the state of New York had a policy that required nursing homes to take in patients with COVID. And in Minnesota, it is entirely up to the nursing homes to decide whether they should admit people as patients in their nursing homes who have symptoms of the virus. What's in your judgment, was Governor Cuomo's policy in New York the right one? Because he's received lots of praise for the wonderful way he's handling things in New York. And Governor Walz has also received a lot of praise for the way he's handled things in Minnesota. So, Chris?
Well, not everyone in the audience here is an economist. We use the Latin terms ex ante and ex post all the time, meaning Monday morning quarterbacking is ex post. I think that in general, I mean, they were very worried about the hospitals being overwhelmed, which just didn't happen. And so because they were so worried about the hospitals overwhelmed, they wanted to get old people out, you know, as soon as you had one negative test, get back into the nursing home. That just turned out to be disastrous. And Florida went the completely different direction. I think it's hard to look at these things after the fact and say, you know, actually, it's easy to look at these things after the fact. It's hard to say, therefore, you should have done this with the information you had. But if we knew then what we know now, yes. The policy of sending anybody of even slight probability of being infected back into a nursing home is disastrous.
Okay, let me, we should really bring everything to a close, but I want to bring everything to a close with one question directed at all of the panelists, and maybe we'll try and do it with Aldo going first, and then Dirk and Jonathan, Victor and Andy, and then Chris and Rishabh can do it. If you had to pick two important lessons from what your academic work has taught you, not about handling COVID-19 per se, but about handling the next pandemic. So take into account the next pandemic may look very different from this one. What are the two big lessons that you think you have learned from your academic investigations of the current pandemic that policymakers, general public, and
economists might find useful? Aldo,
Andrea, Carlo, one of you maybe should go first, or maybe, you know.
Pause 5 seconds waiting to see whether they want to say something, otherwise I realize. 1, 2. So I think the main lesson, can I say? The main lesson is we still don't know. There is I think there are two sides to the story. One says we way overreacted. And our conceptual tools are good to deal with this. I think we have to rethink about those. Something has changed into the way in which we make public policy, which may have taken us to a response to the coronavirus, which is beyond what would be reasonable. Just to give you an idea, to pick a point in our efficiency frontier that is close to the policies that are actually being chosen now, I have to impute a coefficient of risk aversion to the general public, which would make people travel on the highway at 20 miles per hour. We have to reconcile this fact. The second thing is related to the question that was asked to Dirk and the others, the private vices and public virtues. I know the answer to that question. Like, I looked at the data, and here is the answer. If you expect self-enforcement and discipline from self-regarding individuals to stop the coronavirus, forget it. The response when there was no lockdown was minimal. And, you know, people may say, wow, these were really stupid. Look how they reacted. On the other hand, they may, you know, these people made a computation and say, okay, so what's the probability? I'm 30 years old. I go out. I mostly did that. And of course, I know there is an externality. I know there is an externality. But if you let people choose, they will choose a point on the Pareto frontier that you wouldn't, that many politicians wouldn't like. So I think we have to rethink this private vices, public virtues, or whatever. Thanks.
No, that's useful. Pessimism about our political system's ability to handle crises, and a lot of optimism about the economic system's ability to handle crises. Victor, Jonathan, Dirk, Andy, 2 big lessons that you've learned that you think might be useful, or one?
Yeah, I'll say one. So I think one thing that we've learned is that there's a huge difference in how much shutdown you want to do, depending on whether you know a vaccine is going to come quickly or whether it's going to take a long time. Because in one case, more or less the best you can do is to postpone deaths. In the other case, you want to hold on until you get the vaccine quickly. So in that sense, I think investing into getting vaccines quickly, once something like that hits, seems super important given our results.
Great. Chris, Rishad, you guys have anything to add? What do you think?
I guess I would add, I know that people, and there are even some questions were saying, do you feel a little nervous about jumping into epidemiology? Chari answered this, given that you knew nothing about it more than 10 weeks ago. And my answer is, yes, of course I'm nervous, and you should know we're not epidemiologists and so forth. I'm not that happy with the epidemiology field for one reason, which is whenever anybody asks me about what's going to happen in the future, I always usually say something like the quote from, it was a movie guy, nobody knows anything about which movie is going to make it be a hit. I always want to be extremely open about how bad economists are, including me, at predicting the future. Every time we write down a model, there's going to be big uncertainty about whether or not our predictions are right. Whereas I go on TV and I see people saying, take it to the bank, this is going to cause 1.6 million deaths. Every time I see an economist talking with such certainty, I worry. And it bothers me to see people in other fields talking about, I'm going to use the Yogi Berra quote. It's really hard to predict, especially about the future.
On that note, thank you all for participating so actively and being so involved in the present. And we look forward to seeing you at many more webinars in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists and the participants for doing such a great job. Good afternoon, all. Talk to you again very soon. Stay tuned for communications from HHEI about upcoming events, either virtually or in person. Thank you. Good afternoon. Goodbye.
Bye.